The July sun burned hot over the Montana plains, turning the horizon into a haze of gold and dust. The air shimmered like heat rising off iron, and the wind carried the dry scent of hay, horses, and sun-cracked earth. Down the long stretch of dirt road that led to Willow Creek, the only sound was the slow creak of an old wagon and the low hum of cicadas hidden in the grass. It was the kind of day that made even strong men walk slower and women shield their eyes with trembling hands. But life didn't stop out here. In the wild lands of the old American West, work waited for no heartache and no past. He came riding from the south that afternoon, a lone figure against the open sky. His shirt was dusty, sleeves rolled to his elbows, the sun baking his tanned skin. He carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too many miles and too few kind faces. When his horse stopped by the weathered barn, he just sat there for a while, staring at the land like a man who wasn't sure if he was welcome anywhere anymore. Folks around town said he used to be a ranch hand before the war took him away. Now he was back, older, quieter, carrying the kind of silence that had weight in it. Across the yard, a woman stepped out of the barn. Her silver-streaked hair caught the light, pulled loosely behind her neck. She wiped her hands on her apron and squinted toward him. Years had carved gentleness and sorrow into her face, but her eyes still held a spark that refused to die. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The barn swallows circled above them, and the wind pressed through the tall grass like whispers of things left unsaid. "I didn't expect to see anyone come this far west," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "Didn't plan to stay," he replied. "Just needed a place to water the horse." The words were plain, but the way he looked at her, tired, unsure, guarded, made her heart ache in a way she hadn't felt in years. The man dismounted, walked toward the trough, and poured the last of his canteen for the animal. She watched him move, the rhythm of a man used to hard labor, to silence, to carrying his pain without complaint. "You from around here?" she asked, trying to break the stillness that hung between them. "Used to be," he said. "Before everything changed." She didn't ask what he meant. Everyone out here had a before and an after. Before the war, before the drought, before death took someone they loved. Her own before was buried beside the cottonwood tree behind the house, her husband, gone 5 winters ago. Since then, she'd lived alone, running what was left of the ranch with tired hands and fading strength. People came and went, travelers, drifters, traders, but none had looked at her quite the way this man did, like he saw the loneliness beneath her calm smile. He stayed longer than he meant to, helping her fix a loose gate, then hauling hay into the barn when he noticed her struggling. When the sun dipped low and painted everything in shades of amber, she brought him a tin cup of water. Their fingers brushed as he took it, and something unspoken passed between them. Something fragile but alive. "Thank you," he murmured. "You're welcome," she said softly, then turned before he could see the way her eyes had softened. Inside the barn, the air was cooler, carrying the scent of wood, hay, and horses. He followed her in, drawn by something he didn't quite understand. The shadows stretched long as the evening light broke through the wooden slats, striping the floor in gold. She reached for a rope hanging from a beam, and the motion made a strand of her hair fall loose. He wanted to reach out and tuck it behind her ear, but he held himself back. "Place has held up good," he said, his voice rough. She smiled faintly. "Held up better than I did." He looked at her, really looked, and something in his chest stirred. Something he thought had died long ago. She caught his gaze and held it, no fear, no hesitation, just quiet understanding. The world outside faded, the distant sound of cattle, the creak of the windmill, until all that remained was the soft rhythm of their breathing. "You should rest before you go," she said, breaking the spell. "There's stew on the stove." He wanted to refuse. He'd spent years keeping his distance, never staying long enough to feel at home anywhere. But her voice had a way of disarming him, like a melody he hadn't heard since his youth. So he nodded. "I won't trouble you long." That night he sat by her small kitchen window, eating slow, watching the oil lamp flicker. The walls were lined with memories, an old saddle, faded photographs, a worn Bible. She moved quietly, graceful in her weariness. When she poured him more coffee, he noticed the tremor in her hands. "You've been alone a long time," he said. Not as a question, but a truth. She didn't deny it. "Some hearts forget what it feels like to be held," she whispered. "And some people stop trying to remember. The words hit him harder than he expected. He set his cup down, his fingers tightening around the handle. "Please take it easy," he said quietly, his voice breaking with sincerity. "I have not been loved in years." The room fell silent. The wind outside sighed against the windows, and somewhere a coyote cried in the distance. She looked at him, eyes glistening, as if those words had unlocked something she'd kept buried deep. The world felt smaller then, just two lonely souls in a wooden cabin on the edge of nowhere, both aching for warmth but afraid to reach for it. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled. "Maybe love doesn't fade. Maybe it just waits for the right kind of broken heart to find it again." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The weight of her words sat heavy in his chest. He wanted to tell her everything, about the war, the faces he couldn't forget, the years of silence. But he knew some wounds couldn't be spoken of, only shared in quiet moments like this. Outside, the night deepened. Thunder rolled faintly on the horizon, and the smell of rain drifted in through the cracks. She rose and went to close the door, but he stood up, catching her hand gently. Her breath hitched, and for a heartbeat the world seemed to stop moving. "You should stay inside," he said, his thumb brushing her wrist. "Storm's coming. So are you," she whispered, her eyes locked on his. The tension between them grew heavy, almost unbearable. Every heartbeat felt like a confession, every breath like a promise they hadn't made yet. When lightning flashed across the plains, it lit their faces, his full of longing, hers full of quiet strength. But before he could say another word, a sharp sound broke through the night, a distant gunshot echoing across the valley. The horses stirred, and the lamp flickered. He turned toward the window, his body tense, instincts awakened. "What was that?" she asked, her voice low, frightened. He didn't answer right away. His hand went to the revolver hanging by the door. The past he'd been running from suddenly felt a lot closer than it should have been. He looked at her, the softness in his face replaced by resolve. "Stay here," he said, stepping out into the rain as the thunder cracked again. And just like that, the warmth of that fragile evening vanished into the storm, leaving behind the scent of rain, the echo of his words, and a woman standing alone in a quiet house, wondering what secrets the stranger carried and whether love, after all these years, had finally found its way back to her door. Rain came hard that night, washing the dust from the earth and turning the plains into a dark sea of sound. The wind howled through the cracks in the cabin, rattling the windows and making the horses restless in the barn. She stood by the door with her shawl pulled tight, watching the man disappear into the storm. A faint glow from the lantern swung in his hand as he moved toward the edge of the field. Every few moments, lightning tore through the sky, and for an instant, she could see his figure outlined against the silver flash, steady, strong, and alone. Something about that sight twisted deep inside her, stirring a fear she hadn't felt since the day she buried her husband. Minutes stretched into hours. The rain came harder, and thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. She tried to busy herself, wiping the table, tending the fire, pretending not to listen for the sound of boots at the door. But her hands trembled. She poured another cup of coffee, though it had already gone cold, and her mind drifted back to what he'd said before leaving. "Stay here." The words lingered in her memory, firm yet gentle, the way a man speaks when he's used to protecting others, even when no one asked him to. She didn't even know his name. That thought felt strange. How could a stranger's absence hurt so quickly? But maybe it wasn't him exactly. Maybe it was what he carried, a quiet pain that mirrored her own. In the old days, when her husband was alive, the ranch had been full of laughter and light. There were barn dances under the stars, long rides to the creek, and the kind of silence that felt like peace instead of loneliness. Then came the sickness, quick and merciless, and everything went gray. The town preacher had told her that time heals, but time only taught her how to hide her hurt behind routine. Until now. Until a storm brought a worn-out drifter to her door. Outside, a gunshot echoed again, closer this time. Her heart leapt. She grabbed the lantern and stepped out onto the porch, the rain hitting her face in cold sheets. "Hello?" she called, her voice breaking against the storm. There was no answer, only the sound of wind and the creaking barn door swinging open and shut. She hurried toward it, bare feet sinking into the mud. Inside, the horses were restless, eyes wide with fear. One of the stalls had been broken open. Something had startled them badly. Then she saw it. A trail of footprints leading from the barn toward the ridge. Fresh, heavy, and hurried. She raised the lantern higher, but the rain blurred everything. Fear crawled up her spine. She knew better than to chase a man into a storm, especially one who carried secrets like the weight of years. So she waited, standing by the barn door, shivering beneath the thunder's growl, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken aloud since her husband's funeral. When dawn came, the sky broke open in pale streaks of silver and pink. The plains steamed as the sun rose, and the world smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. She found him near the fence line, sitting on a fallen log with his hat pulled low, soaked to the bone but alive. His revolver rested beside him, its barrel still glistening from rain. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. He looked up slowly, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "A rider came through the valley," he said. "Didn't mean harm, I think. Just passed too close, fired a warning when he saw me moving." She studied him carefully. "People don't shoot warnings out here unless they've got something to hide." He nodded slightly. "Or something to protect." His words hung between them like smoke. She didn't ask for more. Instead, she handed him a folded blanket and motioned toward the cabin. "You should dry off before the cold gets to you." Back inside, the morning light fell gently through the window, catching the dust that floated in the air. He sat by the fire, silent, the heat slowly drawing color back into his face. She poured coffee again, this time fresh and warm. When she set it beside him, he murmured a quiet, "Thank you," his eyes never meeting hers. She could tell he wasn't used to kindness anymore. "You fought in the war, didn't you?" she asked finally. He didn't answer right away. The logs popped in the fire. Then he nodded once. "Union cavalry," he said. "Left home when I was 20. Came back to find it gone," she frowned. "Gone?" "Burned," he said, his voice flat. "House, land, family, and all of it. War takes more than it gives." She looked at him with quiet understanding. "And since then?" He shrugged. "Drifting. Working ranches, mending fences, moving on before anyone remembers my name." It made sense now. The guarded tone, the careful distance, the loneliness in his eyes. She saw the reflection of her own grief there. The years had taken different things from each of them, but the emptiness they carried was the same. "Maybe you've been running from something you can't outpace," she said softly. He met her gaze for the first time. "And you? What are you hiding from?" The question cut deeper than he knew. She looked toward the window, where the light glowed over the wet plains. "Memories," she whispered. "Some too heavy to carry, some too precious to let go." He didn't press her. They sat in silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. As days passed, he helped her around the ranch, mending fences, hauling feed, cutting wood. She offered food and a place to sleep in the barn, though she noticed he often stayed awake late, staring out at the dark hills. Sometimes she caught him tracing the handle of his revolver, like a man waiting for something, or someone, to catch up to him. Word spread through the small town nearby that a stranger had taken refuge at the old widow's place. Folks always had opinions. Some whispered she was desperate for company. Others said he was a wanted man. Out here, rumors were as common as dust. One afternoon, the sheriff rode up, a stout man with gray whiskers and a sharp eye. "Morning," the sheriff said as he dismounted. "Heard you've got a guest staying on your land." She nodded. "He's been helping around. Earns his keep," the sheriff tipped his hat. "I'm sure he does. But there's talk a man matching his description was seen near a robbery down south." Her breath caught. "You think he's dangerous?" "Hard to say," the sheriff replied. "Just keep your doors locked, ma'am." After he left, she found the stranger by the corral, tightening a saddle strap. "You didn't tell me you'd been running from the law," she said quietly. He froze, his jaw tightening. "I'm not. Then why do they say otherwise?" He turned toward her, his expression torn between anger and pain. "Because I was there, not for the robbery but for what came after. A man was killed. I tried to stop it. Did they believe you?" He shook his head. "Nobody ever does." The truth in his voice was raw. She didn't press him further, though fear began to gnaw at her. Not fear of him, fear of what his past might bring to her doorstep. Out here, justice didn't always wear a badge. That evening, she stood alone on the porch, watching him in the fading light. He was working the fence line, his figure outlined against the red sunset. He moved with quiet purpose, like a man trying to build something he knew he'd lose again. When he finally came inside, he looked at her with the faintest smile. "I'll be gone in the morning," he said. "Why?" He sighed. "Because peace doesn't follow men like me. It only visits for a while." She wanted to stop him, to say that maybe peace wasn't a place, maybe it was a person. But the words stuck in her throat. The air between them was heavy with what neither dared to admit. When night fell, the sound of distant hooves echoed through the valley again. This time they didn't fade. He stood by the window, hand resting on the gun at his belt. "They found me," he muttered under his breath. "Who?" she whispered. He looked back at her, eyes dark and full of regret. "The ones I should have left behind." Outside, torches flickered in the distance, riders moving fast. The wind carried their shouts across the plains. She felt her pulse quicken as she backed away from the window. "What are you going to do?" He loaded his revolver slowly, the metallic click echoing through the quiet room. "Protect what's worth protecting," he said. And as the first torchlight reached the fence line, she realized that whatever this man had been running from had finally caught up. And before the night was over, both their lives would change forever. The riders came fast through the fog of rain and dust, their torches cutting through the darkness like fire in a dream. He stood at the fence line, coat dripping, revolver steady in his hand. The horses' hooves thundered against the soaked earth, their riders shouting words carried away by the wind. She watched from the porch, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it echo in her ears. He turned once toward her, a silent promise in his eyes, not to run, not to let the past swallow him again. Then he faced the riders as they drew near, his shadow swallowed by torchlight. The men circled him like wolves around prey. Their leader, a tall man with a scar cutting through his cheek, reined his horse close and leaned forward. "You didn't think you could just disappear, did you?" he said, his voice slick with anger. "I wasn't hiding," the stranger replied quietly. The scarred man laughed bitterly. "That's not what it looks like. Folks talk, said you were here living peaceful. That don't sit right with me. What do you want?" "Justice," the man said, spitting into the mud. "You left my brother bleeding in the street back in Kansas. You think we'd forget that?" Lightning split the sky, lighting their faces for an instant. She saw the tension in the stranger's shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. "He wasn't innocent," he said, his voice calm. "You know that." The scarred man's grin vanished. "You still pulled the trigger," because he drew first. The men shifted uneasily, hands resting near their holsters. The storm raged, thunder rolling across the plains like the sound of drums before battle. She couldn't bear it anymore. She grabbed her lantern and ran toward them, shouting over the rain. "Stop this! You can't just come here and spill blood on my land." The men turned. The scarred one's eyes softened for a moment, surprised to see a woman standing in the storm, but his tone stayed cold. "Ma'am, you don't know what kind of man you're keeping company with." "I know enough," she said, trembling but unyielding. "And I know no one deserves to die without truth." The leader's gaze lingered on her, the strength in her voice, the defiance in her stance. He finally lowered his weapon. "We'll be back," he muttered. "This ain't finished." He turned his horse and motioned to the others. Within moments, they vanished into the mist, leaving only the sound of thunder and the smell of smoke from their torches. She turned to him, her voice breaking. "What have you brought to my door?" He holstered his revolver, rain running down his face. "Something I can't undo." "Then tell me," she said. "Tell me what they meant." He hesitated. For years he'd carried the story alone. The night his commanding officer ordered him to put down a man accused of murder, a man who turned out to be innocent. When he refused, the officer drew his weapon, and chaos followed. The brother of the dead man blamed him for everything. He'd fled that night, vowing never to touch a gun again, but out here promises were fragile things. "I tried to do right," he said finally. "But right doesn't matter when the world's already decided who you are." Her eyes softened. "You can't live forever in the shadow of a single mistake." He looked away. "Maybe not, but shadows don't fade easy." For days, the town buzzed with whispers. The sheriff rode by again, asking quiet questions. He didn't stay long, but his eyes said more than his words. Trouble was coming back, and soon. The stranger spent his mornings working the land like nothing had changed, but she saw it in him, the unease, the way he glanced toward the horizon every time a rider passed in the distance. One evening, she found him sitting by the corral, the sunset burning gold behind him. He was carving something into a piece of wood, a small bird, simple but beautiful. When she asked what it meant, he smiled faintly. "Something free," he said. "Something I never was." The days grew quieter after that, though not calmer. The air was thick with things unspoken. She began to feel the pull of his presence. The steadiness, the quiet kindness that filled the spaces her grief had left behind. But beneath that tenderness, she sensed the storm that still lived inside him. Sometimes she'd catch him staring toward the hills at dusk, as if expecting ghosts to ride down from them. Then one afternoon, the sheriff returned. This time he wasn't alone. Another man came with him, a younger deputy, face pale and nervous. They dismounted by the porch and called out. "We need to talk," the sheriff said, his voice grave. She stepped out, her apron still dusted with flour. "What is it?" The sheriff's eyes flicked toward the barn. "Where's your drifter friend?" "In the field," she said carefully. "Why?" "There's a warrant out now, not just for questioning. They want him for murder. Official word from Kansas." She felt her stomach tighten. "He told me what happened." "Then you know it's bad," the sheriff said. "If he's innocent, he'll get his say in court. But if he runs, they'll hang him for sure." When the stranger returned, the sheriff met him halfway. Their conversation was quiet but tense. "You come with us peaceful," the sheriff said, "and maybe you'll get a fair hearing." He didn't flinch. Fairness died a long time ago. The deputy reached for his cuffs, but the stranger stepped back. "Don't," he warned. His voice wasn't angry, just weary. "I've done nothing to deserve chains." "Then prove it," the sheriff said. Before he could answer, a gunshot cracked from the hills. The deputy dove for cover and the horses reared. Another shot rang out, splintering the porch post beside her. The stranger grabbed her and pulled her behind the water trough. "They're here," he hissed. The sheriff ducked low. "The same men?" He nodded. "They won't stop till I'm dead." The air filled with the thunder of hooves. Dust swirled as 3 riders came charging down the slope, rifles raised. The sheriff fired back and chaos broke loose. The stranger pushed her toward the house. "Stay inside." "No," she shouted. "Not again." He turned, eyes fierce. "If you die because of me, I'll never forgive myself." But she stood her ground. "If you die because of me, I'll never forgive myself either." They held each other's gaze for one heartbeat before the storm of bullets came closer. The sheriff's men fired from behind the fence, but the riders pressed harder. The smell of gunpowder and dust filled the air. One of the outlaws fell from his horse. Another circled around the barn. The third dismounted, creeping along the porch like a shadow. Inside the house, the lamps flickered as the walls shook from the fight. She hid behind the table, clutching a small revolver her husband had once owned. The door creaked, and she heard slow boots crossing the floor. A shadow moved in the doorway. The scarred man. He smiled coldly when he saw her. "Didn't think I'd meet the woman protecting a killer." "He's not a killer," she said, voice trembling. He cocked his head. "Then what's he running for?" Before she could answer, a gunshot exploded from outside and the man flinched. The stranger burst through the doorway, firing once. The bullet hit the wooden beam beside the outlaw, sending splinters flying. The man lunged forward, striking him hard across the jaw. They struggled, crashing into the table, knocking over the lantern. Flames spread fast across the floor. "Get out!" the stranger shouted as the fire roared to life. She tried to pull him with her, but the outlaw caught his arm again. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. The sheriff rushed in, grabbing her by the arm. "We've got to go," he yelled, dragging her outside. She turned in time to see the stranger throw the outlaw backward through the window before the roof beams began to fall. He stumbled out moments later, coughing, his face blackened with soot. The barn caught fire next, sparks leaping high into the night sky. The storm had returned, wind howling, rain pouring. But the flames burned fierce against the darkness. She fell to her knees in the mud, watching her home crumble. The sheriff stood nearby, breathing hard, the gun still smoking in his hand. When the fire finally began to die, only silence remained. Broken, heavy silence. He looked at her, his face drawn. "I didn't mean for this," he whispered. "I know," she said softly, tears mixing with the rain. But some things find us no matter how far we run. In the distance, thunder rolled again. The sheriff looked toward the dark horizon, where the last of the riders had fled. "They'll be back," he warned. The stranger nodded. "Then I'll be waiting." And as the ashes of the ranch smoldered behind them, the tension hung heavier than ever. Love caught between guilt and survival, and a man whose past was now closing in faster than the dawn. The rain stopped the next morning, but the air was heavy with smoke and silence. What had once been her home was now a pile of blackened wood and ash. The smell of burnt hay and wet earth clung to the air. She stood barefoot near the ruins, staring at what was left of her life, her hands trembling around the small cross she'd pulled from the wreckage. Behind her, the stranger moved quietly, his shirt torn, face still marked with soot and pain. He didn't speak, just watched her like a man who'd broken something precious he could never repair. The sheriff had ridden back to town at dawn to gather men, leaving the two of them alone with the smoke and their thoughts. The silence between them wasn't cold, it was raw, aching, full of things neither dared to say. She could feel the distance growing again, that invisible wall he built whenever guilt pressed too close. He'd been trying to protect her, yet everything she owned was gone. Still, when she turned to look at him, she saw the same steady sorrow in his eyes that had drawn her in from the start. "You should have let me fight beside you," she said quietly. He shook his head. "You already lost too much because of me," her voice broke. "And you think leaving will fix that?" He didn't answer. His silence said enough. They spent the rest of the morning rebuilding the fence near the corral, both too stubborn to admit that the land itself felt cursed now. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind felt like a reminder of what had been taken. When the sheriff returned by noon, he brought news neither wanted to hear. "They'll be back," he said grimly, pulling his hat low. "The scarred one won't rest until you're gone for good. I sent word east, but help's slow. You've got maybe 2 days before they ride again." The stranger nodded, his jaw set. "Then I'll be ready." The sheriff eyed him carefully. "You could come into town, take shelter at the jail. Safer than staying here." He looked at the woman beside him before replying. "If I leave, they'll burn everything she's trying to rebuild." "I won't let that happen." The sheriff sighed, knowing there was no changing his mind. "Then you'd better keep your gun close." When he rode off, the land fell quiet again. The stranger turned toward the barn, the only structure still standing. "We'll make our stand here if we have to," he said. She followed him, still clutching that cross in her hand. "You sound like a man planning to die." "I've been planning that for years," he said with a faint, tired smile. "This time maybe it'll mean something." Her heart tightened. "Don't talk like that. I'm just being honest." "Then be honest about something else," she said, stepping closer. "Why are you really staying? You could have ridden off this morning and disappeared, but you didn't." He paused, the weight of her question settling between them. His hand brushed the wooden beam as if searching for words. "Because running doesn't feel right anymore," he said softly. "And because when I look at you, I remember what it felt like to want to live again." The truth hung heavy in the air, fragile but undeniable. She didn't answer, just looked at him, at the scars time had carved into his face, at the quiet strength in his eyes. Something deep within her, something she thought had died years ago, began to stir again. But before either could say more, a rider appeared on the distant ridge, moving fast. He grabbed his rifle, instincts taking over. "Inside," he said sharply. She didn't argue this time. From the window, she watched the rider approach. A boy, barely more than 16, with a red scarf around his neck, and fear written all over his face. He pulled up near the barn and called out, "They're coming!" "They're less than a day behind me." The stranger lowered his gun slightly. "Who sent you?" "Sheriff," the boy panted. "Said they've doubled their number. They've got rifles, maybe dynamite. Said you should run while there's still time." He looked back at her. "It's your choice," he said quietly. "Stay and fight or leave everything behind again." She straightened her shoulders. "This is my land, my home. I've already lost enough." He nodded slowly, respecting her courage. The worry clouded his eyes. He turned to the boy. "Thank you. Get back to town. Tell the sheriff we'll hold them off as long as we can." The boy hesitated. "You can't win against that many." The stranger gave him a grim smile. "Maybe not, but they'll remember trying." By dusk, the two of them worked side by side, boarding up the barn and moving supplies inside. Every task carried a quiet urgency. He checked his gun belt again and again, counting each round. She prepared what little food they had left, her hands shaking only when she thought he wasn't looking. When darkness fell, the plains stretched out in eerie stillness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the wind rustled through the dry grass like whispers of the dead. Inside the barn, the smell of smoke still lingered from the fire, mixing with hay and oil. She sat on a bale near the wall while he cleaned his rifle by lamplight. Neither spoke much. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like goodbye. After a long silence, she finally asked, "What if we don't make it?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. "Then we go down fighting for something worth dying for." She blinked back, tears. "And what's that?" He smiled faintly. "You." Her breath caught, and before she could answer, thunder rolled in the distance again. Not from the sky this time, but from hooves. Faint at first, then louder, growing closer with every passing moment. He blew out the lamp, plunging them into darkness. "They're early," he whispered. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. "What do we do?" "Wait," he said, voice low. "Let them come closer. Don't move unless I say." Through the cracks in the wooden wall, torchlight flickered in the distance. Then voices, rough, angry, echoing through the open night. "Spread out," one shouted. "He's here somewhere!" The stranger moved to the door, eyes sharp, every muscle coiled like a spring. She wanted to reach for him, to tell him not to go, but she stayed silent. He slipped outside, crouching behind the fence, his shadow vanishing into the dark. Minutes dragged like hours. She could hear the men spreading across the field, boots crunching on gravel, horses snorting in the cold air. One of them kicked open the shed door, another cursed when he found nothing. Then, without warning, a gunshot shattered the night. She flinched, her hands flying to her mouth. Another shot followed, then two more. Shouts erupted. The sound of horses panicking filled the air. She wanted to run, but fear pinned her in place. Through the crack in the door, she saw muzzle flashes lighting the field like lightning. The stranger moved fast, silent and precise, taking cover behind a wagon. He fired once, hitting the lantern one of the riders held, sending it crashing to the ground in flames. The sudden firelight revealed the scarred man among them, shouting orders. "Fan out! Don't let him slip away!" She could see it now. The man's fury, the desperate gleam in his eyes. He wasn't there for justice anymore. He wanted blood. The stranger reloaded, but his hands trembled. He was outnumbered badly. One bullet grazed his arm. Another splintered the fence beside his head. He gritted his teeth, pressing a hand to the wound. When she saw him stagger, something inside her broke. She couldn't stay hidden any longer. Throwing open the barn door, she ran toward him through the chaos.
"No!" she screamed.
"Stop this!" Her voice cut through the noise, sharp and desperate. For a moment, everything froze. The rain, the smoke, the firelight. Then the scarred man turned, his pistol aimed straight at her. The stranger saw it before she did. "No!" he shouted, lunging forward. The shot rang out, echoing across the plains. She stumbled, the sound of the gunfire ringing in her ears, her vision blurring. The world tilted, and she felt strong arms catch her before she hit the ground. He pulled her behind the wagon, his breath ragged, his voice breaking. "You shouldn't have come out here," he whispered, his hands trembling as he held her close. "I couldn't watch you die," she gasped, clutching his sleeve. Another volley of shots cracked through the air, splinters flying around them. He looked up, fury burning in his eyes now. "They wanted me," he said quietly, "but they'll get hell instead." He rose to his feet, every movement filled with a grim, determined calm. She tried to stop him, but he only gave her one last look, one that said everything he couldn't speak. The kind of look a man gives when he knows the storm has finally caught him. Then he stepped into the open, gun drawn, his silhouette outlined by firelight and smoke, facing down the men who had chased him halfway across the country. The scarred man raised his weapon, shouting something lost to the wind, and as lightning tore across the sky, the stranger took his first step forward, toward the final reckoning that had been waiting all along. The thunder rolled across the valley like the earth itself was holding its breath. The firelight from the fallen lantern flickered across the stranger's face as he walked forward through the drifting smoke. Every step he took was heavy with years of guilt, loneliness, and quiet rage. The wind caught his coat, the smell of gunpowder still thick in the air. The scarred man waited for him in the open, pistol steady, his men circling like vultures. For a long moment no one moved. The horses whinnied, restless, the night holding on to its last bit of stillness before everything would break loose again. Behind the wagon, she tried to pull herself up, clutching her arm where the bullet had grazed her. The pain didn't matter, only him. She could see him through the rising smoke, standing tall against the odds, facing the men who wanted him dead. He looked like he had when she first saw him, alone, tired but unbroken. She wanted to scream for him to stop, to turn back, but her voice caught in her throat. The scarred man cocked his gun, his smirk lit by the glow of the fire. "This time, no one's here to save you." The stranger didn't flinch. "I don't need saving." His voice was low, calm. "But you do." The scarred man laughed, raising his pistol. But before he could fire, thunder cracked again, not from the sky but from the sheriff's rifle echoing from the ridge. The bullet struck the ground inches from the outlaw's boots, throwing dirt into the air. Startled, The riders turned toward the sound, confusion spreading among them. The sheriff and 2 deputies rode hard into the fray, guns drawn, shouting for the men to drop their weapons. The moment of surprise was enough. The stranger fired once, disarming one of the outlaws. Another lunged toward him with a knife, but the stranger dodged and struck him hard across the jaw. The fight turned fast and brutal. Shouts, gunfire, the crash of hooves. She could barely see through the haze of smoke and dust. Only flashes of movement, the sound of struggle, the hiss of the wind. When it ended, the night fell quiet again, broken only by the groan of the wounded and the hiss of rain returning over the plains. The scarred man lay on the ground, clutching his arm where a bullet had torn through. The sheriff dismounted slowly, his hat dripping. "It's over," he said firmly. But the stranger didn't lower his weapon. He stood over the man who had chased him across half the country, his chest heaving. The scarred man looked up, hate still burning in his eyes. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You'll still be what you are, a killer." The stranger's hand trembled, the gun aimed at the man's chest. Then, after a long silence, he let it drop to his side. "No," he said softly. "Not anymore." He turned away, holstering the weapon, his shoulders slumping like years of weight had finally come crashing down. The sheriff gave a small nod, signaling the deputies to take the prisoners. The scarred man was dragged to his feet, cursing into the rain. When it was done, the stranger walked back toward her. She was still sitting near the broken wagon, her face pale but her eyes bright. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing her cheek gently. "You're hurt," she smiled weakly. "You came back. I couldn't leave you," he said, voice trembling. "Not again." The sheriff approached, tipping his hat. "You're clear now," he said quietly. "Kansas sent word. Turns out that warrant was built on lies. The man you killed was wanted himself. You were defending another soldier. They just didn't care enough to hear the truth." The stranger blinked, his breath catching. "You're saying I'm free?" The sheriff nodded. "As free as a man like you can be." For the first time in years, he didn't know what to say. He looked down at her, his hand shaking slightly. She reached for him, her fingers lacing through his, grounding him in the moment. The dawn broke slowly over the plains, the rain fading to a soft drizzle. Smoke curled upward from the burnt remains of her home, but the fire was gone now. Only the smell of wet ash lingered. The sheriff and his men rode off with the prisoners, leaving the 2 of them alone in the quiet. They sat side by side near the ruins, saying nothing for a long time. The wind moved gently across the land, whispering through the tall grass. She looked at him, seeing not the drifter who had arrived lost and broken, but the man who had stood between her and death, who had fought not for himself but for something greater, something he didn't even realize he still had left to fight for. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. He stared out toward the open horizon, the sun breaking through the clouds in streaks of gold. "I don't know," he said. "For the first time, I don't have to run." She smiled faintly. "Then stay." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You'd have me here after all the trouble I've brought?" "You didn't bring trouble," she said. "It was already here. You just helped me face it." He reached out, brushing a lock of damp hair from her face. "You deserve peace." "And maybe you do too," she whispered. They stayed there until the light warmed the fields and the smell of rain faded. He helped her gather what little could be salvaged. A few unburned boards, a saddle, the small cross that had somehow survived the flames. Together they began to rebuild the fence, their movements slow but steady. The silence between them had changed. It no longer carried sorrow but something gentler, hope. By the time the sun was high, he had rolled up his sleeves, his skin glistening in the heat. She watched him work, her heart heavier and lighter all at once. The pain of what they had lost lingered, but so did the truth of what they had found. Out on that lonely stretch of land, surrounded by ashes and open sky, 2 people who had spent years running from their pasts had finally found a place to stop. That night, they sat by a small fire outside what remained of the barn. The stars stretched wide above them, bright and endless. The plains were quiet again, save for the low hum of crickets. He handed her a cup of coffee, his hands rough but gentle. "I used to think love was something I didn't deserve anymore," he said quietly. "That maybe some people just aren't meant to find it twice." She looked into the flames. "Love doesn't come when we think we deserve it," she said. "It comes when we need it the most," he smiled softly. "You sound like you've known that for a long time." "I learned it tonight," she replied. The firelight flickered across their faces as they sat in silence, both lost in their thoughts. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel heavy with loss. It felt alive. He reached for her hand and she let him. The warmth of his palm against hers said everything that words couldn't. The days that followed were slow and steady. The sheriff returned once more to check on them, bringing nails, lumber, and a promise that the town would help rebuild. He left with a nod, saying, "You've both earned your peace." As the weeks passed, grass began to grow again where the fire had burned the hardest. The land healed itself quietly like it always did. The stranger stayed, helping fix the barn, replanting the small garden she thought she'd never see bloom again. He never said the words aloud, but she could see it in the way he looked at her, in the way he lingered at dusk just to hear her hum an old tune, in the way he smiled when the wind carried the smell of rain. Sometimes he'd wake before dawn, walking to the ridge where he could see miles of open land. The sunrise painted the world in gold, and for once he didn't feel like a man on the run. He'd come back to the porch where she'd be waiting with coffee and a quiet smile. Their lives became simple. Fences to mend, meals to share, and long evenings watching the sky turn red over the Montana plains. The world around them still carried its scars, just like they did. But both had learned that scars don't mean something is broken. They mean it's been through the fire and come out stronger. One evening, as the summer air cooled and the wind rustled through the tall grass, she leaned against him and said softly, "You once told me you hadn't been loved in years." He looked at her, the fading sunlight soft against his face. "I remember," she smiled. "You can't say that anymore." He took her hand, his thumb tracing the lines of her palm, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, I can't." And as the stars rose over the quiet land, two hearts that had been lost to time found their home again. Not in a house, not in a town, but in each other beneath the wide, forgiving sky of the wild Montana plains.